Hello, friends in Sydney.
From A to Triple Z.
You're listening to 4ZZ FM in Brisbane.
An original 4ZZZ podcast series diving into the station's archives to explore the patchwork past, cultural significance and incredible stories of Brisbane Community Radio 4ZZZ.
Hi, I'm Alicia McLaren. I produce Stacks on 4ZZZ, which airs on Wednesday mornings from 6 till 9. I got my start at the station while I was at uni producing a graveyard show with a new friend who would quickly become one of my best mates. I didn't grow up in Brisbane, so encountering Triple Z meant lifting the lid on this exciting alternative scene that felt so perfect for me, but that I wouldn't have known existed otherwise. It was also the first time I'd ever met so many queer and gender diverse people in real life. Seeing them involved in the local community and just being comfortable in their own skin was really affirming to me as a young person. And considering that, I was so delighted to be able to chat to Gai Lemon to mark Zed's 45th anniversary. Gai was a long-time announcer here at the station, starting on the queer radio program back when it was called Gaywaves, and leading it through the period of transition that saw the lesbian show introduced, which is now Dykes on Mics. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Beautiful. I'm not usually in this recording studio, and I was like, please don't drop the line.
Oh, it's so funny because when I worked there, we didn't have anything quite like that. Or if you wanted to use some recording, it all had to be very much pre-recorded, and yeah, good luck with that. But anyway.
Well, I'll get into it. Would you mind just introducing yourself for the record?
My name's Gai Lemon, and I was on 4ZZZ from 1990 to 2000.
Wow. That's so cool. I guess if we let's start at the beginning. How did you first encounter Triple Z?
Oh, my first encounter with Triple Z, what a story. My first encounter with Triple Z, I was actually doing a counselling course with what was then the Homosexual Community Welfare Service, which later became Gay and Lesbian Welfare Association. And I was doing my counselling training with some delightful gay men, and one of them, David Miskov, who's still a friend of mine, and I catch up with him when I go down to Sydney, he said to me, look, why don't you come into radio one day? We're doing radio at 4ZZZ, and we do the Gaywaves show, and there's a mixed show, and it would be lovely to have you come in because we don't get many lesbians coming in. And so that was my introduction to Gaywaves, or the mixed show as it was back then. And what happened was I was the only lesbian amongst a bunch of about 8 gay men, and I remember really clearly my first experience when David walked out of the room and everything was on air, and he said to me, all you've got to do is just press this button and it will change the record over, because back then we had records, we weren't using CDs because this was pre-CDs, and it was hilarious. And I remember I was terrified, and then when I switched it over, because back then when we were using the old slide deck to do the mixing, I must have tapped something incorrectly, and the sound, I couldn't hear the sound going through the speakers, I didn't know whether we were on air or not. And I remember saying to David, please come and help me, I don't know what I've done wrong. And I think it went to air. So that was my first experience of encountering 4ZZZ. It was a hoot. I'd never really heard much about it until I did the counselling course, because I was one of these kids that grew up very mainstream. You know, I listened to all the usual Josh on radio, and hadn't really got into the alternate scene. And so Triple Z was a real eye-opener for me. And I remember very clearly when I was working in a factory, putting myself through uni, and I would listen to 4ZZZ at night when I had the opportunity. And the good thing with that was that you could flick it over very quickly if you were listening to the Lesbian Show or Gaywaves or whatever. You could flick it over very quickly to a mainstream station if somebody else came by, so you didn't have to worry about them finding out that you were the dreaded homosexuals. So yeah, it was wonderful.
I mean, were you out at the time?
I was very lucky. I came out with a bit of a bang. I guess having this name helped a bit. I don't know how my parents ever thought I'd grow up to be straight with a name like Gai Lemon, but I was very lucky in that I had a lot of good self-esteem, I think, around my sexuality, particularly my sexual identity. And I came out when I was 28 years old. I had previously been in a straight relationship for many years, with a reasonable amount of success, I think, trying to be heterosexual. But I found that I was very easily transitioning into this new identity of being a lesbian. And for me, I was very lucky. I think Triple Z was a big part of that transition because I started in 1990 and I came out in 1988. So by then I'd been fairly involved in a lot of the queer movements in university where I was at QUT, but also in terms of getting involved with the Gay and Lesbian Counselling Service. By that time I was actually president of the organisation, which was crazy. So I was definitely out when I was listening, or when I was on Triple Z. But when I was listening, I wasn't completely out at the workplace where I was working, but I think anybody would have guessed if they'd put their mind to it.
Was there a lot of other media and programming that the local queer community could access? At
the time, Queensland Pride was just starting. The magazine was just starting. We'd already had the first Gay and Lesbian Pride celebrations, but in terms of actual media, it was quite difficult to access anything other than local print media, particularly for people that were living outside of the Brisbane area where they couldn't easily access street press. They might have been able to subscribe to Lesbians on the Loose, which was a Sydney-based magazine, and so that was fairly Sydney-centric. There was also the Lesbian Network magazine, which was specifically for lesbians, had a very strong separatist leaning to it, and it was almost an underground magazine that, very few people knew about unless you were sort of in the know. But other than that, there wasn't a lot of media around, particularly when I first started at Triple Z. Later on, Brother Sister magazine came into being, and it was a little more infotainment. Queensland Pride maintained much more of a newsy approach in the early days. And so Triple Z really, for a lot of queers, was the only way of getting information. And we used to stay on top of whatever was happening around. We did a lot of networking with community organisations to get their updates about any events or things that they were involved in. And so we were doing a community service, I guess, in lots of regards. We were passing on that news and information as part of our updates, and certainly bringing people into the studio for interviews and just trying to expand the awareness about what was available for LGBTIQ plus people at the time. And there wasn't a lot else. I remember a story from a couple of people. One woman I knew was studying at Gatton at the Ag College out there, and she used to travel in a little way towards Ipswich so that she could get the signal for Triple Z on her car radio, and she would listen to the 3 hours of queer radio, Dykes on Mics, and then she would go back out to the Ag College where she was staying. So for a lot of people that were living in quite rural areas or areas where they didn't have access to mainstream or even the community rags, they were able to get information that way. And we hear a lot of stories even now. For example, there were a number of people that were in prison at the time. They also used to listen very regularly to us, and they would send us fan mail, and we'd give shout-outs to the guys inside. On one occasion, I even went out with Reverend Ivor Holmans, who was with the Metropolitan Community Church. I went out to one of the Brisbane prisons to visit the guys that were listening to us, and it was fantastic, you know. So that, yeah, it was just simple ways of getting information out, but yeah, it was such a vital role that Triple Z, particularly those shows for people who are quite marginalised, and what they played during a very turbulent political time in Queensland history.
How did you actually get started announcing, and how did that progress for you?
So, aside from my first really dodgy attempt with Dave at that time, that was hilarious. I grew in confidence. I was a reasonable public speaker. I'd done a lot of public speaking, and was often asked to do public speaking to be like Exhibit A, the lesbian, at various events and things like that. So I had a reasonable amount of confidence in public speaking. Plus I was trained as a teacher, so okay. I was used to having an audience of sorts. And eventually over time what happened with what was the mixed show, Gaywaves, and the lesbian show was that we were working at Toowong at this time, so this was after it had been kicked off campus. But we were at Toowong, and slowly what seemed to happen was that there was a real attrition of some of the more regulars in the Gaywaves itself, and also in the mix show. So it ended up eventually only being myself and Jeff Ward, who was doing some of the work with Gaywaves originally. And Jeff and I ended up being the entire programs for probably about 12 months or so.
Yeah.
And we decided then, because politics in the queer communities was really moving in a much more progressive and proactive way. There was Queer Nation, there was lots of outing of famous artists and performers and things like this, and the word queer was really gaining some cachet, and Jeff and I were both involved politically, very active. I was with the Queensland Association for Gay and Lesbian Rights. I was the lesbian co-chair of that, and Jeff was very involved with ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. As activists, we felt it was important to reflect that in the programming. And so what happened was, once we had moved to the current location where Z is now in the Valley, we were the second show, I think, to go on air from the new location. I have photos from that time. It's hilarious. There's wires hanging down everywhere, and it's quite crazy. But I remember Jeff and I started thinking, okay, we need to maybe rebadge this and reflect the activism that is happening around us at the moment, and hence Queer Radio was born. And not long after that, we still had the mixed show, but we decided that because it was essentially just Jeff and I decided we'd do 2 weeks of Queer Radio and then 1 week of the lesbian show. What happened was, slowly we started to recruit a lot of new people coming in to the studio, and some of them are still good friends of mine. Deb Murphy, for example, is still one of my closest friends, and Nat, heaps of the women that were coming in are still good friends of mine. And it ended up being almost like a little family. And so we were notorious for having too many people in the studio. I remember it wasn't unusual for us to have 15 people in the studio for Queer Radio, and certainly probably 8 or regulars for Dykes on Mics. And the Dykes on Mics name came about when we'd moved into that format of having regular women on the show, and it was really expanding. We were bringing in musicians, and they were playing live. And we had some regular fans, and one of the women wrote in, I think I still have the letter somewhere at home, and she said, "Dear Dykes on Mics." And I thought, my God, what a great name. And so that's what we adopted. So we were the first to use Dykes on Mics. It has been used elsewhere, but we were the first in the country to use it. So very proud of that. Our regular listeners would know what time we were on. We had a particular format that we would run, and they knew what time they could tune in for specific things on the show. It was a 3-hour format. It was a lot of work, but it was a labour of love, and totally enjoyed it. Fabulous times. I remember it with great fondness. Back then, there weren't a lot of drug and alcohol-free places where particularly younger queer people could go, and so it was an opportunity whereby people who didn't have other places to go could come, knew that they were completely safe because we were like family, and we would look after whoever's in the studio with us, make sure they were safe, you know. And afterwards we would go out for a coffee, usually down the road at one of the cafes in the valley, and that was another opportunity just to be social. So for us, Triple Z wasn't just the on-air time, it was the after-air time as well, before and after, and we would rally together for Pride marches and things like that, you know, under a queer radio banner, and it was a pretty potent time. And I remember speaking to the parent of one of the young women who used to regularly come into the show. She was only 14, this young woman, and Carly's still a friend of mine, when she would come in. And I remember her mother said to me the day that Carly actually got married, she said to me, I always knew Carly was safe with you. She said, you were like her other mother. And I thought, what a wonderful thing, you know. So for us, that was the joy of the shows.
I'm curious to know, was there ever like any critique of the need for queer programming, or did you ever like kind of get backlash for carving out that time?
Never. The one thing I've always loved about Triple Z is that if ever there was a station that honoured the different, the marginalised, the disenfranchised, it was 4ZZZ. And queer radio and Dykes on Mics and the whole concept of having queer content has been integral to Triple Z almost from inception. And not once did we ever feel that the shows themselves weren't worthwhile. There were times when we were challenged by having our time on air whittled back. We originally started out as a 3-hour format weekly, and then it went down to 2 hours, and that felt a bit awkward and challenging because we had so much content, and 2 hours was very hard because we became very much a talk-based show.
Yeah.
It wasn't unusual for us in a 3-hour period to probably only play about 8 songs, you know, because the rest of it was really about communication. The one piece of pushback we got internally was when we changed the name to Queer Radio from Gaywaves. The jazz show that had always followed the gay programming found it particularly challenging, and at the time the word queer wasn't broadly accepted, and so there was a bit of a pushback with regards to that. But other than that, we were pretty lucky.
Talking about some of the content and the people that you would have in to guest on the show, in your memory, do you have any favourite guests or really standout interviews that you guys did?
Oh, in terms of queer radio, one of my favourites was regular guests was a priest from one of our local communities, and he was so funny. He was a gay man, but didn't openly identify as such. And I remember Jeff accidentally outed him on radio one day, but I would wonder why a father was actually on air when in a gay show when he wasn't obviously gay. But one of my favourite shows that we did was certainly looking at the breadth of religious and spiritual tradition within the queer communities, where we interviewed a range of people from different faith traditions and talked about that, because that's always been very contentious, you know, whether or not you can be a Christian person and queer. Oh, there were so many others. Another funny one we did for the lesbian mothers was interviewing the mothers, but also interviewing the kids, and it was hilarious because I remember one of the children, a boy named Jono, he his parents had been his two mothers had been very honest about how he'd been conceived, and that was using the turkey-based method to self-inseminate. And it was funny because he was telling us how he got in strife one day for sticking blue tack inside his father. And I'm going, well, what? And it was because he'd stuck blue tack inside the turkey base that was used to inseminate his mother. That was hilarious. And then the other thing was there was a young girl, Cassie, and I'm still friends with Cassie and her mum too, which is hilarious. Cassie was only 4 at the time when we interviewed her on radio, and she was talking about how she found out that her parents were lesbians, and that was when she'd obviously walked in on them and they were making love. And that was hilarious. And she was also talking about how if she couldn't get what she wanted from her two mums, she'd go to the neighbour who felt sorry for her because she had two mums, and the neighbour would give her whatever she wanted. And this was the first time that her parents had heard anything about it, was when we were interviewing her on air. So it was hilarious. So there were some fun ones like that. There were some really wonderful interviews that we did.
I'd love to touch more on, like, as you were saying, you and Jeff were really involved politically alongside your work at Z. What were your main activists, I guess, priorities when you went through that kind of rebranding of the show?
Well, we'd recently gone through decriminalisation of homosexuality, so that happened towards the end of the 80s. Mm-hmm. And early in the 90s, what we were really looking at, particularly 1991, was looking at anti-discrimination legislation. So Queensland didn't have any anti-discrimination legislation at that point in time, and one of the key things that we were fighting for, obviously, was to ensure that anti-discrimination legislation upheld the additional protections that weren't offered just through decriminalisation. So that was very much a big part of it, was talking about that. There was a lot of gay hate crimes still occurring in Brisbane around that time as well, in the early 90s. I mentioned in another interview recently that one of our young people was assaulted and killed one evening after the show. They'd left the show and they'd gone up to a local hotel and unfortunately had been assaulted and killed in the car park there, and that was a heck of a shock for all of us. It really reminded us of just how important having good legislation in place, but also how much we had to fight for the right to just simply be, because there was so much hatred around still. So very much trying to break down those barriers of stigma and discrimination, and creating those safe spaces where we could be, our communities could be, without being assaulted. So that was really the prime thing. But also too, I think, for us, our priority was to allow our communities to know that they were okay, that they didn't have to make excuses for themselves, that who they were was perfectly fine, and that because we as a collective had been so discriminated against and had been treated so appallingly, and obviously the more intersectionality that you had, like if you were a black person, if you were transgender, or if you were intersex or Asian or whatever, you know, all these additional layers upon layers of potential issues that people have to confront simply because of other people's prejudices. What we were really trying to do very strongly was to create spaces and places that showed that, yes, these are all important. They shouldn't be the reason for you to be denigrated or made less than. It's vital that you are supported in the wholeness of your wonderful being. One of the things I remember, we got a letter from... Dykes and Mike's got lots of fan mail. We used to regularly come into the show, and it'd be our pigeonhole would be full of letters from women who listened to the show. And I remember back then, of course, writing letters or phoning was really the only way that people would connect with us. We didn't have email, we didn't have computers as such. We, so it was very much snail mail. And I remember we got a letter from a young woman who would regularly write into us, and she was struggling. You could tell that she was struggling, and she said that really the only reason she was staying alive was to listen to the shows, because she felt that that was her lifeline. And I remember one day we got a letter from her, and it was clear that she was not in a good way at all. And in fact, she was, we were extremely worried by the tone of the letter. And I remember we spent a good part of the show trying to reach out to her and get her to touch base with us and let us know that she was okay. And I know we didn't hear then on the show, so we were left feeling very heartsore and weary, because we thought, she'd taken that ultimate leap. Fortunately, not long after, we did get a letter from her saying that, she'd turned around, she'd listened to the show, heard us, and look, it was such a relief. But that's the sort of thing that the show did. It provided a lifeline for so many people that wouldn't otherwise have had access.
How did it come to be that you wrapped up your time with the program?
With the program? So in 2000, my mother died, and it was a big time for me. I also had started feeling quite burnt out.
Yeah.
I was super involved with way too many things, which is my want. I was not feeling the same sort of focus that I needed when I was coming into Z. The other thing for me was my mental health was starting to suffer, and certainly the loss of my mother was a big trigger point for me. And I remember announcing to Deb and Nat, who were two of the announcers at the time, and saying to them, look, my time has come, I need to go. And I was really sad. It was one of the biggest decisions I'd made. I loved the show so deeply, and it really was like a part of me, and still is. It's still something that I feel incredibly proud of being part of.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. It's interesting when I was talking to Ruth, she was kind of saying that over the years, the way that Dykes and Mikes especially has kind of changed, is going from a really activist show and something that was really politically centered to nowadays, she said, it's not activist, but definitely a lot more entertaining, broader. And she kind of talked about the early days and the way that the activism of the past, because the show and because the community kind of fought for their rights in the past, now it's a space that's more entertaining and more of a community gathering than an activist platform. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. No, I totally get it. Yeah, and I think, and you're right. I mean, I think we've seen that too in the changes within the street media as well. There's not the same focus in street media on activism as there was in the past. There's still a need for activism around certain issues, the same-sex marriage debate, for example, classic example, and other things that come up now and again. However, the era in which we exist now is so very different to what it was 30, 40 years ago. We're in a completely different space. 30 years ago, we had only just received decriminalisation of gay men, and anti-discrimination legislation is actually 30 years old this year. So we're looking at very different situations, and I think it's hard for a lot of particularly younger people who, say, if you're in your teens now or even your early 20s, what we went through in the 90s, which was also too at the peak of the AIDS pandemic, which was decimating the populations, but seeing the rise of like the hospice movement and the home and palliative care movements, we started to see the rise in that, and a lot of lesbians and bi people were involved in those sorts of things. We've seen huge changes since then, and I think it's hard for people to recall what it was like back then unless you lived through it, and there's still a lot of trauma. Even I remember when lockdown happened last year at the beginning of COVID, for a lot of people who were watching the discussions around a virus that was killing people, it triggered a lot of memories from the early days of HIV/AIDS because the language was startlingly similar. And equally, a lot of my older gay male friends who lost entire peer groups were saying that it really almost mirrored that time, but they felt stronger because of it, because they'd already lived through one virus, you know. And so nowadays I think the infotainment component is important as well because, again, it's still reinforcing queer culture. And this is one of the things that I know I've certainly moved on in terms of when I talk about LGBTIQ plus things now. I talk about us as having, it's more about a cultural understanding. It's not just about the nature of difference. There is a genuine and definitive culture that aligns with those of us, particularly in those communities where there's a type of language that we use, there's shortcuts in the language that we use, there's celebrations that we have that are very, very focused on those, on what is more broadly termed as queer culture. And I think it's important to celebrate that and look at what it is that unites us much more than what divides us.
Totally. It is lovely when you have just that designated space to feel like you're surrounded by people who have that shared language and those references and that thing that like makes you feel special.
It's so vital, and we need so much more of it. You know, like I remember a time when Brisbane was really far advanced in terms of even like the number of venues they had for like women-only spaces back in the day that were, you know, we have far more lesbian venues than even Sydney. And it's a shame in some regards that we've gone down the track now where it seems to be almost too homogenised right across the board. I love it when we have our own spaces. Like, you know, like I think there's still a place for where all of us, regardless of how we identify, we sometimes need to be with our own tribe, you know, and have those spaces where we can see ourselves reflected in the people that are around us. And I think that's, you know, like certainly have the collective spaces, they're so important as well. Have those spaces as well where we can see our own tribe, and I think that's equally valid.
Oh my, I'm just thinking I would love there to be a lesbian bar in Brisbane. It's wild to me that existed.
I've always said, like, you know, the best event you can ever attend is the first night of the opening of a new lesbian bar, because that's usually the only time you'll get everybody there. After that, it sort of falls on its arse. I don't know what it is, but yeah, should talk to Ruth about that. We need to get something started.
I mean, that's pretty much all that I had. Was there anything else that you wanted to add? Any kind of like final reflections on anything I've missed?
Oh, I don't think so, darling. I think you sucked me dry. No, it's all good.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you. I'm chuffed to have been asked.
This podcast was produced across the Turrbal, Yagara, Juggara and Yugambeh people, and we acknowledge that sovereignty over these lands was never ceded. This episode was produced by me, Alicia McLaren. I'm a volunteer at 4ZZZ and I host the show Stacks On. You can listen to it online at 4ZZZ.org.au. Executive producers are Max Rowley and Grace Pashley. Sound design and theme production by Lucinda McAfee. This podcast has been produced to tell some of our stories for our 45th birthday. If you like what you hear and want to support the survival of independent media and community radio, you can visit the links in the show notes to make a donation, buy some limited edition merch, or even subscribe. Make sure you subscribe to From A to Triple Z so you get updates every time we release an episode.
of your favourite indoor plant. Cabbage coming out of my eyes. My elbows on the front of my eyes. On the left is coming out of my nose. And you hear the music up and running my toes. You let you go.